Welcome to the Manitoba Ag Days podcast, featuring speakers from our 2017 event. This podcast features John Hurd from Manitoba Agriculture, and his talk is called The Benefits of Pulse Crops in the Rotation.
Thank you, Jane. And Jane, forages are a good thing too, in rotation. But I'm not going to talk about forages in rotation today, but mostly the pulse crop benefits. I'm not here to tell you something you probably don't already know. But there will be one thing, some piece of data, two sets of data that I'm sure you've never seen before, and it may trouble you as much as me when we look at this. But it is something to consider. I'll talk about some of the generalities and then pinpoint that with some of the research that's been conducted. So when we look at pulse crops in Manitoba, we have to focus on, what are those that we're actively growing? And these are Elaine, do we have enough crop diversity in Manitoba? Like, my chart could just keep going. Yeah, we have a lot of potential crops that we could grow in Manitoba. So I'm just getting rid of the clutter there to focus on what are the main acreage crops and the pulse crops. And so, of course, canola and spring wheat predominate the acres in Manitoba. Soybeans are this purple line. And down here, jockeying for position, we have that orange line are dry beans. The one below it is field peas. And then hovering in around here, somewhat under 100,000 acres per year, would be lentils or peas. And those just kind of surface every once in a while when the price is high. And so, yes, there are pulse crops growing in Manitoba right now, rather predominated by soybeans. Soybeans are not really a true pulse. They're an oil seed, but since the Pulse Association championed the expansion of soybeans, we throw it under their basket there. So if we're looking at those, you say, well, what are the advantages of pulses? These are the ones that I've come up with, and I'm sure they're on your list also, is that we're going to see we should have higher yields of wheat and canola and other crops. They can meet their own nitrogen needs, and some will contribute nitrogen to other crops. They've got soil microbial diversity, a lower carbon footprint, low residue, may accommodate zero-till and reduced till of following crops. Some cool season pulses actually do well under zero-till. Some are low water use. Of course, they break disease cycles of insects, diseases, weeds, generally. And one other nice thing is that you don't need to capitalize in a new line of equipment right away to grow many of these pulses if you're in a traditional cereal canola system. To look at, I'm really grateful, my coworker Anastasia has tapped into some of the more recent crop insurance data to look at what is the yield impact of following different crops based on the 2010 to 2015 yield averages. And again, I want to get rid of the clutter. So these are the yields compared to yields following red spring wheat. So that's the 100 index. And so following peas, this is a no-brainer that, of course, the yields could be higher when spring wheat follows anything other than spring wheat. But that's the index that we'll compare the others to. So peas and soybeans, spring wheat does well after those crops. So if we look at what are the yield winners following pulse crops, of course, it's spring cereals after pulse crops. And of course, some of that is just due to the disease rotational benefit because it's not after spring wheat. Canola and flax are yield winners after pulse crops. Who are the losers? There are losers after pulse crops too. If pulse crops after pulse crops are not very good, and potatoes are a real loser following pulse crops. Any idea why that is? You're not putting any residue back in the soil. The reason you grow rotational crops with potatoes is to make up for the loss of crop residue. So you don't grow low residue crops in association with low residue crops. And the ones with mixed results is winter wheat. And of course this one, why winter wheat yields low after peas? Because you scrape the soil. You're not leaving any residue to hold the snow catch. So there's a lot of, you can explain why some of these reasons are here. Corn was not always a winner after pulses, weren't doing that well after peas. So quite often these are intuitive. You're well versed and you know what many of these reasons are. I like to go to this, and don't write down the website. You just need to Google USDA crop sequence calculator, and it summarizes data out of Bismarck. I think it's Bismarck, near Mandan, North Dakota, where they did studies following crops, following different residue of other crops. And it not only lists what the yields were, but the reasons why that yields performed differently. So for a few examples, dry beans followed by spring wheat. And they said, you know, it produced 99% of the highest yields that they had. So that's a winter rotation. And why is that? And it goes to, you know, why the disease risk is less. So dry beans are moderate to light water user. Weeds are not really a problem because you've got a broadleaf followed by a cereal. And similarly with insects, not a lot of common insects. So I like this crop sequence calculator because it does give the reasons why it is that they observe different yields. So you could run through this. Here's wheat after soybeans. Again, the yield picture is not quite so good. It's 3 bushels or more or less yield. So why is that? Well, in Mandan, North Dakota, soybeans rob water from the following wheat crop. So soybeans are not considered a water sipper, they're a water guzzler. And so that's what they see as impacting, maybe reducing yields in those dry land situations. Soybeans to canola, again, not one that's a very good fit for them, and of course the reasons why, of course, we've got some diseases that are similar, such as sclerotinia. Again, we've got a heavier water user, and weeds isn't detailed here, but if you've got weeds or if you've got crops that have similar herbicide tolerance packages, then you may actually build yourself into some weed problems and others. So a nice spreadsheet or interactive thing that you can tap into, and it has other crops also that I've gone into, you know, lentils, what are those? Chickpeas? And what are those? A lot of these crops, I'm from Manitoba, so I don't know what lentils or chickpeas really look like. But trust me, you can go and see how the cereals or canola, their success after those crops. We have some prairie pulse rotational studies that have recently been published, and I want to note those. And looking at generally peas, lentils, chickpeas, faba beans, and they followed through 2 cycles, you know, to canola, then to barley, and then same crops to wheat, and then to canola. So to look at some of this data is kind of neat, and when I look at it, I look at the 2 options. You're the farmer, you're the one paying for nitrogen. You make the decision where you want to capitalize on the pulse crop. If we look at, for example, the canola yield following wheat, peas, or lentils with very similar yield, what was the nitrogen required to grow that? Well, there's a 25-pound nitrogen saving following peas versus lentils. Or, and maybe that's the Saskatchewan approach, in Manitoba, in extension, we kind of focused on take the yield, not the end credit. But again, that's a farmer's individual decision. I would look at that and say, well, why not fertilize with the full rate and cash in another 4 bushels of canola? That just about pays for 25 pounds of nitrogen often. So you do have that consideration to make. You've got a nitrogen credit, or you can take that extra yield credit. And now we're 1 year beyond that. This is what is really baffling to me, but I can't dispute the data. This is, we grew these pulse crops, or they grew these pulse crops, followed with canola, and then followed with barley. And with similar yields, they were still seeing a nitrogen credit, but they were also seeing some yield benefit. there also. So that pulse benefit was still extending into the second crop. I don't think I've ever seen this or heard of this before. So really interesting results there. Now the study, when they had some of those same crops followed by wheat, and here they reported the data somewhat differently, but they figured out what was the most economic yield, and then what was the nitrogen rate at which that most economic yield was achieved. And we could see, of course, wheat after wheat, there's a yield hit there. Yields are fairly similar, whether it's following canola, peas, or a number of these pulse crops. And then, again, there's about a 25-pound saving in nitrogen, getting similar yields with less nitrogen. One of the ones that I kind of need to make note of here is faba beans grown for seed. They weren't seeing all of those same nitrogen credits. And I'm thinking maybe it's behaving a little bit like soybeans behave here. These other pulse crops, they're harvested late summer, early fall. Quite a bit of time for maybe some mineralization of nitrogen to take place or residue decomposition. Then faba beans are kind of like soybeans. That's late fall. There's little opportunity for any mineralization or whatever. But nevertheless, interesting. But let's go to the crop following wheat, the canola crop. And again, they're looking at huge nitrogen savings. But I'm seeing, I consider that a little misleading, because here you're giving up 1 to 3 bushels of canola there for that saving. But nevertheless, interesting data that's on the table now, and something to consider. Something I'm going to be watching for to see if the second crop out is still showing this pulse yield effect. So why is it happening? It's because we've got symbiotic relationship and we've got rhizobium that form on most pulse crops. And to go back to some, Don, I borrowed this from your slide set, but again, it's the work done in southern Alberta there that basically quantifies or compares different pulse crops and those that are deriving a lot of nitrogen from the atmosphere versus kind of the losers like dry bean that are only half in the game. But if we look at, what are the amount of nitrogen fixed for that crop, it could be a huge amount. Now, many of these, the crops remove most of this nitrogen in the grain. But certainly there's a great potential there. And you can see why in that previous study they were somewhat interested comparing a faba bean green manure to see how much of that nitrogen would be available. Classic work by our friends. Bob Soper just passed away last fall, Don. But Mike Grenier sports the same haircut as I do, but he's still around. And this is classic stuff. And I like to say, we figured it out in Manitoba before those people did in the last 5 years, that how to interpret these curves. Is this showing us a nitrogen benefit to pulses, or is this this is some of that unexplained benefit above nitrogen? And if someone's here in the room like Regas, these could be the different curves that you get open pollinated canola to hybrid canola. If it was strictly a nitrogen benefit we were looking at, these curves of wheat following faba beans, peas, lentils would simply start here, and then they would get no higher yield than a fully fertilized wheat crop. But these curves are actually above. Same thing as we saw when hybrid canola arrived, is that it's a full shift of yield above the previous one that we had. And so, again, Manitoba growers have a decision too. If I only wanted to grow 44 bushels of wheat, in this case, that was achieved with about 65 pounds of nitrogen, or 25 pounds if I followed a pulse crop. Gold star for Mr. Trudeau, Scott. I've reduced my nitrogen rate. But then you're forsaking the pulse benefit that's accrued in yield and protein. And in the past, as long as nitrogen costs are modest, it's always been more advantageous or profitable for Manitoba farmers to fertilize similarly and take the extra yield and quality. But, this depends on nitrogen costs. And if nitrogen costs are very high and onerous, well then maybe it's time to start taking into account some of those credits. These credits can vary. Work done in Carmen by Dave Shinovic back in 2002, comparing things, and this is with those types of yields. This is the apparent nitrogen credit to the following wheat crop. So we can see that peas, pretty good nitrogen credit, 3 years out of 4. Not always, but 3 years out of 4. So pretty good chance. Dry beans, mixed results, and again, fairly low. Chickpeas, I just don't think we grow good chickpeas in eastern Manitoba. So again, not much credit. And soybeans, they contributed about as much nitrogen as a flax crop to the following wheat crop. So not something you're going to count on much when it comes to nitrogen credit. People are disgusted with this data. They would love to think that there's a nitrogen credit after soybeans. So research like this will continue until they find it. Good luck. Because this is what happens when we grow soybeans. It's a field where we measured plant uptake over the course of the year, and a 46 bushel crop took up 200 pounds of nitrogen and removed all but 22 pounds in the seed. And actually, it left the soil with less nitrogen than when it started. And so we have data from AgVise labs like this that show, 5-year average, what's the residual nitrogen following wheat, canola, barley, potatoes, and corn? Well, they're all higher than residual N following soybeans. Let's talk about losers when it comes to nitrogen. Dry beans, we're actually known for having pretty good and pretty aggressive nitrogen recommendations for dry beans because they're such losers in the nitrogen fixation world. And you're hard pressed to find nodules on those roots. Look at some of our nitrogen rates. If you're looking at good yields of dry beans in narrow rows, we've got some fairly aggressive nitrogen rates. Higher for narrow rows than wide rows because one of the attributes is more nitrogen places pods higher and so enables direct harvesting better. An interesting chart here that I pulled together to explain why we might be seeing some of that nitrogen benefit or apparent nitrogen benefit. It's due to the crop residue quantity and quality. And these are studies that Adrian Johnson had done in Saskatchewan and some I had completed in southern Manitoba. And the yields that we achieved, the tons per acre of straw that were produced, and then the amount of nitrogen, and then the carbon to nitrogen ratio, which is the quality aspect or the ability of that to break down and decompose. And first thing is we could see that these cereals, like corn and wheat, can have up to 2 times as much residue. Again, those wheat yields, no one's growing those wheat yields anymore. So multiply that up by whatever your yields are. So we can have some fairly high straw loads with those crops compared to pulse crops. I found it very interesting when I compared the amount of nitrogen that's returned in the straw is fairly similar across those. But when we look at how that compares to the carbon to nitrogen ratio, those with the lower carbon to nitrogen ratio are more apt to break down or decompose. If I look just at that, my soybean residue is no different than wheat residue. There's not a lot of nitrogen in there. The only thing is there's less residue than with those. And so it's not a case that there's a lot of nitrogen credit. It's just there's less immobilization when we grow pulse crops because there's less residue. We're really not putting more nitrogen back. There's just less residue. Don, did I get all the points on that one? I've milked that one about as far as I can. Reduced till options. Pulse crops, some pulse crops fit really well into reduced or zero till. Peas, lentils, chickpeas, fava beans, the ones that are cooler season, and there's some good opportunities for soil structural improvement that come with a reduced till management system. And my past co-worker, sorry, my hearing aid has gone. Yeah, my speaking. Elmer sends me, thank God love him, we can grow lentils in Manitoba. And there's some a lentil crop in direct seed in canola stubble, and some peas into wheat, these ones after the rolling. And so some of these crops actually fit very well within a zero-till system. Our dirty little secret. Some of our warm season pulse crops don't. Dry beans and soybeans, there's a number of growers in this room that are doing otherwise, but the vast majority of our acres come with some baggage when it comes to soil management, with some real risk of soil erosion and degradation. I don't know if any of you remember this day, but the same thing happened on May 14th, 2013. Scott, you were showing satellite pictures yesterday, right? I'm sure you were. Here's ones. This is from outer space on May 14th, and you can see the dust blowing in the western side of the Red River Valley from outer space. And crop insurance measured that there was over 133 acres of of canola that was affected because of some of that extreme blowing that went on. So it wasn't just the 30s. We can still experience some of these conditions. So why is that many of our soybeans and dry beans are typically seeded into black soil? Elmer Koski told me that they even burn stubble sometimes up here in order to put soybeans in. A story to me, I haven't seen that. But soils tend to be darkened up. It's very typical to roll soybeans, whether they're stones or not. People don't like those ridges at harvest. But that pulverizing leaves our soil very vulnerable, and we clean a lot of ditches in the valley some years. So that's one of the ones that comes with a bit of baggage. And then this continues to be an issue for some soybean growers, is being able to chop and spread residue. Depending on that straw, whether it will chop and decompose. Some years it will spread just like canola stubble. Other years it's a real challenge. And so my colleagues stateside in Ontario roll their eyes when I indicate that, there's a lot of this done on soybean stubble in the fall. So, and then if we compare dry beans, I come from Ontario. We call this scuffling in Ontario, and we call this pulling beans. I think the Western vocabulary is called this in-row cultivation, where it's essentially summer fallow. It's tilling in June and July, and then this pulling operation or undercutting operation, again, leaves the soil pretty vulnerable. And you can see there's not a lot of residue that's going to be returned to the soil here. So there are challenges under these traditional managements. But they're not required. Those aren't required activities, and I'd encourage you, Marla Rickman will be talking this afternoon about some of the tillage options and other things, and we can direct harvest edible beans too. We don't need to be in those pulling operations. In some of those cases, and we do have farmers in parts of Manitoba too that are following some of those crops with cover crops for some of that erosion. So farmers are choosing and can make some things that may make these more sustainable. But let's go back. Some of the Western studies, they're not comparing those crops versus soybeans and edible beans. They're comparing versus fallow. And some interesting things. Dr. Gann in Swift Current has summarized this and basically saying that, by putting pulse crops in our rotation, can we simply substitute for the summer fallow that's still being done in that area? And they found that, yes, in many of the cases, so this is wheat after another cereal, the two pulse crops of dry pea, lentil, and the black is summer fallow. And this is the amount of rain that was captured or received the previous summer in the growing season. And they found that, summer fallow really only conserved, or 79% of the previous growing season moisture was not conserved by summer fallow. So summer fallow in itself is not very efficient at banking moisture. And in several cases, that the pulse crops were doing similar, and in this case, better than the cereal crop. But again, they're kind of narrowing the gap. But really, what they're saying, summer fallow is oversold as far as its water storage. And if we look at what is I've taken from Perry Miller here, and I've kind of adulterated his water use efficiency map or information to show how many inches of water is required to grow 60 pounds or a bushel of these crops. And we can see that peas, chickpeas, and lentils are fairly efficient. Wheat is very, very good too, about 1/3 of an inch of water required per bushel. Soybeans and dry beans, not so efficient. Part of the reason is that these are cool season pulses, so growing early, using their moisture early in the season when there's not as much evapotranspiration. But soybeans and dry beans growing and through August and maybe later, they're using water in the heat of the summer, and it's much less efficient use of water converted to grain. The pulses, as they measured there, yeah, they do contribute nitrogen to the following crop. How's that compared to their summer fallow conditions? Well, they actually found in some cases the pulse crops contributed more nitrogen than the summer fallow in their situations. And that was because sometimes the summer fallow allowed nitrogen losses in the fall when it was uncropped. So, and something interesting they note here, the cereal monoculture systems had little or no change in post-harvest soil nitrogen. So that's why we could say, we don't get so bent out of shape now when you soil sample on cereal crops, that you can start earlier, because these would be fairly modest change in nitrogen levels in the fall. And in yields, the durum wheat was their test crop. They found, 3 years out of 5, durum yield following pulse crops was similar to fallow in regards to, the water banking and the nitrogen contribution help produce equal yields. So they're seeing that pulse crops a real benefit there simply by displacing fallow in the rotation. I don't understand everything about greenhouse gases and carbon thing, but thank goodness Dr. Gann has done some of this work with some of their long-term research there. I think that's what's required over the long term. You need to look at soil organic matter changes and things like this. So this is under 3 or 4 rotations that they have. And this is actually looking at what's the pounds of carbon dioxide equivalent per acre. And note that this is all banked. This is stuff going in the air. So these are all kind of winners when it comes to this is reductions in carbon dioxide emissions. And so, the least winner is fallow, flax, wheat, but pulse wheat rotation is in their situation definitely the winner. Reasons, well, of course, there's reductions in fertilizer nitrogen when you're growing the lentils and reducing the nitrogen for the following wheat crop. And they noted increases in organic matter, but these were all, the cropping ones were all under a zero till. So they attribute it to both those. It's reductions in tillage and it's reductions in nitrogen use. Give the positive carbon dioxide picture here. Soil biology is also different following pulses than other crops. You're all very aware that mycorrhizae are our friend. They're the friendly fungi in the soil. And here's a picture from Ag Canada here, a flax root and mycorrhizae. Of course, they germinate from little hard spores, but the working part is these hyphae or strands that go through the soil. And in here, the arbuscules, that's where the plant supplies carbohydrates or sugars to the fungi. In return, these strands, they can explore parts of the soil that the root tips or the root hairs can't get to. And by exploring the soil, they can tap into, we often think of phosphorus being the key one, although it can aid in picking up some micronutrients also, strictly through increasing the surface area or the volume of the soil that's explored. And pulse crops are mycorrhizal in nature, and so they benefit from the mycorrhizal in the soil and uptake of phosphorus. But conversely, they leave the soil, when you're done, with intact hyphal networks. And in zero-till situations, when you come in and zero-till into that, we don't need to wait for spores to germinate, produce hyphae, and recolonize the root. That we actually, going in there, we can have advanced, or the crop, if it's colonized earlier with mycorrhizae, will start picking up phosphorus early in the season. After canola, if we're waiting for corn after canola, these spores, there's still lots of them in the soil, but I think some of the data shows it takes about 50 days for those spores to germinate, colonize the root, and really start doing their thing. That's too late for phosphorus uptake. So if these crops, and ideally with zero-till, then we leave those networks rather intact, and other crops that are dependent, flax, canola, sunflowers, should benefit from that. The other thing is these mycorrhizae also secrete glomulin, a type of glue that helps hold soil aggregates together, and aggregates held together it provides you more stable soil structure, that allow water infiltration, resist erosion, and those things. And other studies out of Alberta actually look to quantify, well, what are the relative amounts of, what's the diversity in populations, microbial populations in the soil with or following pulses. And so this is how many million bacteria per gram of soil after a fallow wheat, continuous wheat, or following the pulses of lentils, peas. Vetch isn't a pulse unless you eat the seed, so it must just be a forage or a green manure crop. But nevertheless, the pulses are showing that it has at least double the bacterial numbers, and this is the number of 1,000 fungi per gram. Again, increases in the fungi populations in the soil. And remember, I can't quantify this or vouch for this, but diversity is a good thing. And so diversity in numbers is deemed to be favorable. Likewise, the activity of many of these enzymes in the soil that help with nutrient cycling and things like this, they also tend to be increased following those pulse rotations compared to fallow wheat. I'm just looking at the relative enzyme activity. So there are sometimes hard to quantify, but probably things that contribute to some of this pulse yield benefit. So I've done a little chart here on, what are some of the pulse benefits that we might be looking at, and then which pulses contribute to that. And we can see that with our Manitoba crop insurance data, we tend to see that yield increases are fairly, you'd be expected with these pulses, particularly with cereals, canola, crops like that, consistently, which don't need any nitrogen. Well, they're all good, except for dry beans. Again, we fertilize or recommend fertilizing those with nitrogen. Which of the following in benefit? Well, interesting, those studies. Some of our studies showed a great nitrogen benefit after faba beans, not so much in the recent Western Canadian studies where they took it to seed, and really not a nitrogen benefit following dry beans or soybeans. If there's an apparent nitrogen benefit, it's strictly because there's less residue to immobilize nitrogen compared to a corn crop. And if someone wonders, why do the Americans have nitrogen credits following soybeans? They're comparing the nitrogen requirements for a soybean or nitrogen requirements for a corn crop following a previous corn crop. Remember? 3 tons per acre of residue, high carbon to nitrogen ratio, versus corn following soybeans, low residue crop with a more favorable carbon nitrogen ratio. It's immobilization. It's not a credit. A credit is a word we use for uninformed farmers, but for sophisticated farmers, they know that it's immobilization is the factor. So, some of our pulses do work well under reduced till. Some can do well, but it's more of a challenge. That some of them enable zero till because they're low residue producing crops. They sometimes are better at enabling other crops to be grown with reduced till. Some conserve water. Soybeans were not in that book, but some of us, we want to grow soybeans because they do use more water in Manitoba. So that we would put as a plus. And those that are profitable in Manitoba, I really don't know about these, but some people thought so this year because we did have an increase in pea and lentil acreage. But the mainstays, the ones, the post crops that are consistently profitable, we'd think would be dry beans and soybeans. And so my summary, post crops often do provide benefits to those following crops, but not all pulses are equal. The pulses themselves may not be that different, but it's the production practices that we're growing them under. If we're growing them under with conservation systems, then they may do well. But if we're growing them under traditional heavy tillage and interrow cultivation, we can suffer some soil structural problems. And conservation practices would improve their contribution and their picture. And like I say, I'd encourage you, Marla Rickman's going to show some of our success stories with growing soybeans under reduced till. And I talk to people here at Ag Days that as soon as John Hurd puts a slide set together, they tell me about how they're zero-tilling edible beans and direct harvesting. You do that, you've got a winner. There's no soil degradation happening under those systems.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you at Manitoba Ag Days 2018 from January 16th to 18th.